Morning and welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee, where we're more or less beginning our inquiry into the future of Scotland's high streets. So we'll begin by just asking each of, we have a bevy of professors today. I don't know what the collective noun is for a group of professors, but we have three. So if I could just ask you all to say your names and what your specialism is. So I'll start with you, Professor Parker.
Professor Cathy Parker from Manchester Metropolitan University, and I look at the way that individual in towns try and make their towns and high streets better, individual people, businesses, councils, how they work together.
Thank you.
I am Professor James White, Professor of Planning and Urban Design at the University of Glasgow, and I've worked on a project that looks at the sort of adaptability and transformation of Scottish cities and UK cities. And I also run a project that looks at place-based adaptation of the built environment for the climate emergency.
I'm Leigh Sparks. I'm Professor of Retail Studies at the University of Stirling. If I've got a specialism, it's about change in retailing and change in place.
Thank you very much. Look forward to hearing from you this morning. So I'll kick off. This committee ran a public survey at the end of last year, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that over 3/4 of the correspondents indicated that they were unhappy with their local high streets. How would you characterise the current health of Scotland's high streets and town centres? I'll start with Professor Sparks this time.
I think the first distinction I'd want to make is between high streets and town centres, that the two are interrelated but they're not the same. And it's always worthwhile remembering that and having that in our focus, that town centres are broader, high streets are about the retail commercial hearts of town centres and places. The survey in one sense doesn't surprise me, but in another sense is a good example of wanting to have your cake and eat it, in that we've seen massive change in high streets and town centres over the last 60 years. We've decentralised and disaggregated retail. We've done that over a range of different activities as well. So offices, cinemas, warehouses, places that people go to, health centres increasingly now. And we've also, in the last 30 years, changed the way in which we operate through online retailing and through online generally as being part of our life. So it's changed the way people move around and where they go. And as a result, we shouldn't be surprised that town centres are having to change and adapt, and are changing and adapting in many different ways. We've got too much space, but we're repurposing that space in many town centres, and there are good things going on. The final point before I pass over is, if we think about change in high streets, the growth that's occurring through some independent retailers in many places, we need to recognise that many high streets are doing quite well. There's a perception it's different to what's been before, and that difference is somehow worse. But actually, for many people, the high street is a place they still go to, still want, and we're seeing businesses operate there. There are others that are struggling much more badly, often related to affluence, poverty, and a range of other issues around that broader town centre.
Mr. White.
Yeah, I think I would say something rather similar. The narrative of the death of the high street, I think, is probably overblown. It's sort of more of a story of transition. And I think at the height of the COVID era, things were really bad. We were constant news stories about shops closing, and boarded up storefronts. But actually, there has been some buoyancy and return to prosperity, and certainly in some of the bigger cities. Glasgow's Buchanan Street, parts of Princes Street in Edinburgh are doing very well. But this is, as Leigh said, this is a lot to do with adaptability and what the high street means to people. And I think in the past, perhaps it meant that you'd go there and you'd see all your familiar shops. But it's changing, and it's changed. There's much more food and beverage in city centres. Opportunities to go to coffee shops, cafes, restaurants are opening in units where perhaps they couldn't open before because it was dominated by retail. And I think I'd agree that this tends to look and feel better in more affluent places. And we can point to examples where things are going really well for those towns and centres, but they don't look the same anymore. The types of uses that are there are very different. It is harder to pull that off in in more deprived places, where I think more partnership models and direct investment from government are probably needed to kickstart the type of transformations that are easier in the more affluent high streets.
Thank you. Professor Parker?
Yes, so nothing really much to add to that. I think one thing I'd say is there's a difference between perceptions and the reality in a lot of places, and regeneration has tended to focus on physical regeneration, but your survey shows that people's perceptions are also important, and I think that's where some of the work of the High Street Task Force in England. So I'll talk much more about England because that's what I'm familiar with. That's where the intervention was needed, was to help people feel more connected to their local town centres, and with more better communications and more explanation of the changes that high streets are going through. Public, even local businesses, are often sort of a bit shut out of what that story is. So I think that's important. They are, as my colleagues have said, we did a piece of research. We found 234 factors that influence the vitality and viability of the high street. It's complicated, and it always has been, but we don't think about the mechanisms for managing that change. And I think unless we think about that, then we're constantly looking backwards. What's the last change? How do we deal with the internet and things? Well, that's not going to go away. What's the next thing that's going to happen to high streets? If we don't have the infrastructure in place to manage change at that local level, then they're constantly, just at the mercy really of what the next change is that's going to come along and mean that people shop differently, want different things, and so on.
Probably brings me quite neatly into my next question, which is what would you say are the best indicators for judging how well a high street or a town centre is performing? Maybe we'll stick to high streets for this purpose, but what would those indicators be, the best ones?
Okay, well, in the High Street Task Force, we looked at indicators, at different types of indicators for different things, but we tried to keep it simple, have a small basket that everybody can sort of measure. So footfall is really useful because it tells you how many people are going to the high street, so I'd say that. Something like vacancy rates are useful, but they're more in the medium term, and you need some vacancy because you want small businesses to move into empty property. So that's not, you use vacancy in a different way that you need footfall. But we also looked at perceptions. So we looked at how the local newspaper talked about the high street, and also local Facebook groups and so on, because it's not much, you need to get hearts, minds and feet. And then finally, the indices of multiple deprivation. We don't want high streets and town centres to be looked at in a separate way to some of the big issues and what policy and public funding should go into. Jobs, growth, health, they all need connecting into what's going on in terms of regeneration plans and the town centre. And I mean, that's sort of illustrated with things like betting shops or takeaways. You've got public health concerns. They need tackling in the offer of the high street, as well as some of the other mechanisms, hospitals and doctors and other things that we're used to seeing. So try and connect all that up. And that's not really, in England, I won't talk about Scotland, so I think you have a lot more in Scotland to do that type of coordination and connecting, but I'm sure it could be improved still.
Do you add anything, Professor White?
I had lots of the same things, low vacancy rates, diversity of uses, flexibility over how that space can be used. I think public realm quality is a really important indicator, and there's a really important role for government to play in that, in identifying sources of funding to support that. City deal money has been used in Glasgow for the avenues projects and the current changes to George Square, which shows that the city's serious about wanting to make the main streets work, and BIDS and other organisations that bring partners together have also invested money in the public realm. Higher quality, pavement and bins and benches. These things actually really matter to make a place feel like it's somewhere you want to spend time. I also think clear evidence of a plan or strategy is important. And sort of identifying who the sort of champion is for the area and how they can be supported. And linking that plan to sort of shovel-ready initiatives. If I was to criticise one part of the sort of development of the avenues in Glasgow, is that they've been very slow to be finished, and the streets have been closed, which makes it difficult for operators over a number of months and years. So being able to deliver those projects quickly and really make a difference, I think is important. A good example in England, and Cathy will know more about this than me, but is I think Hull, and they did a number of investments like that, and also worked to go out to other parts of the country to speak to investors, to invite them to Hull to see the sort of spaces that they could invest in with the public realm improvements that have been made.
I suspect too, Professor White, that you're absolutely right about the issue of perception is important, and I think in Glasgow we've lost a trick. As a Glasgow member, we've lost a trick because very few people actually understand what's going on with the avenues, and it just looks like a horrible building site and seems to have gone on forever. So I think there's been a lack of that storytelling, that preparation of people too.
I think that's quite right. And what's sad about that is that where bike lanes and other infrastructure like the avenues have opened in Glasgow, the use of them has been quite remarkable. I live on the south side of the city where infrastructure has been built to go into the town, and you know, you'll see 5, 6, 7 people as the lights change on their cycles in Glasgow weather, making their way into town, and that's really good. But yeah, you're right, that if it's a building site for a very long time and it snarls up traffic, these important interventions can become a negative.
Yeah, I think some of the blind and partially sighted community have got some issues about the way in which some of the bike lanes have been
that's right.
constructed.
That's a whole
other story, yeah. But we'll not go there. Sorry, Professor Sparks, would you like to add?
Can I deepen rather than add, perhaps? I think you need to be careful about focusing on single measures, and what you've heard is about a basket of measures more than anything else, but also to understand what measures show and what they don't show. So if we take footfall, for example, and measuring footfall I think is important, and measuring where people go in places is important as well. Why should we expect footfall to be where it is now and the same as it was 10 years ago if we've decentralised everything, people have moved online, people are working from home? Our expectations should be different, and that goes back to the perceptions point. In vacancies, the vacancies are about the ground floor levels. They say nothing about what is above the ground floor, the spaces we have there, where we should be trying to get more of those spaces used as well. So we need to be careful about fixing on one figure and not understanding that figure. There's also an important point is everyone measures stuff. Who's doing something about it? So if you look at Aberdeen, for example, and what they've been doing in Aberdeen with the Upper Floors project and what they're doing in the vacancy rate projects around Union Street, that's about getting a whole group of people together, getting them into buildings and actually doing something about the vacancies and changing behaviours as a consequence, both from the owners and also from the occupiers who want to go in there. So the figure is the start of the conversation. It's not the end point of the conversation. I'm afraid that's where too often the media tends to focus on. Oh, it's 15%, it was 13%. That doesn't take us very far.
We in private earlier on were discussing the difficulty that happens when the properties above a shop, for example, are not let or where the owners can't be found, and certainly colleague Lillian Jones has examples of that in her area, as I have in mine, and I think almost everyone else had too. So that's something that we will pick up in the course of our inquiry too. But I'll pass over to Lillian now for the next question.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks. Good morning. This is to everybody. Is it possible to define what a thriving high street looks like?
Well, go on, you start.
Is there people there? I think that's really, that's really important. And I think, showing. We were talking about, when we're doing physical investment and shutting things down and so on. regeneration has focused too much, I think, on the things that take quite a long time to bring people back in. So a thriving town can look thriving just because it's got a good market or it's got a festival or an event. So they're important too, when you're fixing some of the things that might take a little bit longer. In my written evidence, you'll see that we've done quite a lot of work on sort of classifying and sort of building some typologies of different towns. So I think, a sustainable town is one that's meeting the needs of the people that visit it, and they may be slightly different. So there isn't a blueprint for what you need in a town to make it successful. There is a certain amount of that, but you have to understand the sort of nuances and the differences between places and who they're really serving. I think one thing that if I was going to say what's a recipe for this would be always think about the local population first. Especially in sort of more tourist areas, the conversation can often be dominated by what do visitors want, but there's always a lot of people that sort of live around a town or in a town, so that's a very good starting point. And making sure that the people that can walk in or cycle have got everything they need for everyday life. So sort of convenient shopping, some banking services, transport, and those things. That's a good starting point. But after that, you have to understand the sort of other people that are coming in and the reasons that they come. Culture, heritage. Is it near to the countryside or is it coastal? And have strategies for those people too.
I think I would add that a thriving place is perhaps very different now to what we might have thought it was 10 or 15 years ago. And a smaller high street, we might have expected to see smaller versions of the shops that we would see on a big high street. And that's just not the case anymore. So a thriving place, I think, is a more mixed use place. Mixed use in terms of different types of retail operator, perhaps a greater percentage of independents alongside national level shops, but also a mix of use in terms of use, bringing residential back as into the town centre. I think is particularly important, but also recognising that the town centres aren't just for shopping, but they're also for experience, and whether shops have been changed into other types of uses, cinemas where there was once a shop, for example, even in Glasgow examples of sort of indoor mini golf and axe throwing, God forbid, and other uses that have gone into units that were shops and are now for entertainment.
There's nothing different in what I'm about to say to that. I'll try and summarise it. I'd written down 3 things and for a presentation I'm doing in a couple of weeks' time around the same point. The first was about activity. But it's not just the volume of activity, it's a breadth of activity. So it's different types of activity for different things. Whether it's axe throwing, though I chair a cultural unit as opposed to anything else, so I think I prefer mine. There's something about engagement, about people being engaged in the place and engaged in the activities within the place. And then clearly from a commercial point of view, there is about people spending money and spending time in a place as well. So I think it's around that gives you the sense of it. The place, there's no, we got 500 towns across Scotland above 1,000 population. So there's no one size fits all around this. They will have different characteristics. And in one sense, it's quite interesting that we've gone to vacancy and gone to the issues. We've not gone to the assets. So what are the assets in a place? Because that will be the beginnings of that activity, that engagement, that dwell, as people, sometimes tourists, but often residents, build around those assets. And I think that's the important mix of all of those that comes together.
Thank you. And I speak to constituents. I'm the MP for Kilmarnock and Loudon, and Kilmarnock is going through some really big changes just now, once are confirmed. But the biggest thing that when I'm speaking to my constituents, they say the town centre, the high street, it's in decline. So how do we reverse that narrative?
So one thing, if it's all right, that I think is to think about the planning system a little bit. And I think one of the big challenges we have for the town centre is the types of other development that we give permission for in other parts of the town. So I suspect on the edge of Kilmarnock there will be retail parks with drive-through restaurants attached to them. Some of them now even have local services, like doctors or dentists integrated in them. And these are very car-based environments. They're particularly hard for people who rely on public transport to get to, but they're very popular and they're often very busy. And so I think there's a strategic approach needed at a local authority level, in the context of national planning that's talking about sustainable places, to be very careful about what is given permission outside of the city centre and what impact it can have on the town centre itself. Back in the 1990s, this conversation was all about the mega malls that were built, Silverburn and Braehead and Trafford Centre in Manchester. But there's been this sort of creeping and slightly quieter development over the last 20 years of these retail parks with 4 or 5 shops and a couple of drive-throughs. And the moment one of those get built, it's another nail in the coffin for going into town. And I think that's a real challenge. And it also relates to the type of housing we build around these places, which is also low density, which is also car-based. If we had mechanisms to support the development of a higher density, not necessarily high-rise, but higher density housing in our city centres above the high street, these would be other things we could do to make high streets not be just retail destination, but potentially neighbourhoods of the future. And I think that's one of the things we should be thinking about. But we have to make those decisions in the round and remember when we approve things on the edge that they're going to have a knock-on effect on the centre.
You positioned it very much as decline. I think it's about change. And if I go back to what I said at the start, exactly what James has just said about the decentralisation, disaggregation of all sorts of things, not just retailing, our lives in all sorts of different ways. Housing is a good example of that. And also the online elements means that we should not be expecting our town centres to be what they were 50 years ago or 30 years ago. We can't. So the narrative of decline, which is normally based on vacancy rates and the type of shops, is the wrong thing. It's about change, and you have to change that narrative. Having said that, if I could go to a slightly different part of that. If we want town centres to thrive, and if we want them to be successful, we need to show that through our actions. And we don't. It is cheaper and easier to build out of town than it is to build in town. VAT on renovations is a good example of that. It is cheaper and easier to operate out of town than it is in town. The taxation system on online retailing. 30 years ago, Amazon came into this country and have now got, if we take online as a whole, somewhere about 26 to 30% of the retail market. And that is no longer really in the taxation system in a proper way. We've not matched our taxation to the economic activity, whether it's decentralised and whether it's through the rate system, whether it's through supporting small businesses, whether if we say we want these things, we say we want thriving high streets, we say we want independent businesses, we say we want community enterprises, and we want them in town centres. All of the signals we do in a fiscal way are the exact opposite.
Here, here.
In the new futures, which some of you hopefully will read or will get some summary of from your secretariat, which we did 3 or 4 years ago, that's one of the key areas. Some of that's devolved, some of that is not devolved, it's reserved to the UK government. There's something there for UK government, because if you want to support individual town centres, you have the actions that James is talking about, individual places, you have the town teams, the place plans, all the good work that is going on. But to be blunt, many of them are pushing water uphill, because the structural, systemic operation of high streets and town centres is against independent businesses in those places. And if we don't change that, affluent town centres will continue to do things. Those with good community spirit, the Highlands and Islands in many cases, will continue to do those things. But the bulk across the country, it will not go at the pace we need it to go to reverse 60 years. So it's also not just, in my view, and I know this is relatively controversial, about not allowing new out-of-town development. It's doing something about the out-of-town developments we have currently and thinking that through. And we can talk about climate emergency in that lines, we can talk about a range of things. But we've got to reverse the damage and make it easier and cheaper to build to work, to operate businesses in town centres, or we're going to continue to have the narrative your constituents will say.
Fantastic.
Supplementary from Kirsty Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair. Professor White, you mentioned housing, and Professor Sparks, you mentioned the cost of building out of town as opposed to in town. I think when you look at town centres and trying to encourage more town centre living, there are particular challenges around that often because the spaces for building are smaller, and a lot of developers don't want to invest in smaller developments because they can build more out of town for less. So it's a bigger investment for them to build in town centres and maybe build the kind of properties that people need to live in town centres. So I wonder if you have a view in any kind of mechanisms that should be considered to encourage builders to build within our town centres, and hopefully that will promote more of that town centre living and the mixed use of our town centres that we say that we all want to see.
Yeah, I think that one of the things perhaps Scotland is lacking that England has is a housing delivery agency in the guise of Homes England, because there isn't an equivalent body in Scotland. Because I think everything you've said is right. The volume house building industry is used to building a particular product on the edge of town, and that's what they do. Outside of this city that we're sitting in the moment, where different developers are able to make high-rise and dense buildings viable, because London's a world city, this isn't the case in Scotland. The volume builders know how to build on the edge of town, and I have criticisms of the quality of that, of the places they create, but that's the model they've got. So Glasgow, for example, has a city living strategy, a really interesting and forward-thinking document about making the centre a more livable neighbourhood. But I think the state is going to have to play an investment role in making that viable. There'd been a hope that build-to-rent housing would make its way from cities like Manchester up to Glasgow, but a lot of that's on hold at the moment because of concern from investors about rent controls in the Scottish Parliament. But there has been a significant rise in the amount of purpose-built student accommodation going into Glasgow city centre. An enormous number of units have been approved. That's one way to put people in the city centre, but it's not necessarily a sustainable way to create a livable place. Student populations are largely transitory, and you're not necessarily creating the types of units and neighbourhood facilities that a population of elderly or people with young families would be able to move to. So I think if we had some form of agency that could leverage and support through investment developers to take on these more complicated and sites that they would see as not viable in city centres, I think that would be a really important step forward. And we do need to remember, though, within all this, that these buildings are difficult. If they're looking at conversion, they're deep floor plates, they're above different types of uses, it's often hard to get light and servicing into them. They're expensive if you're using the old stock. It's a little easier on vacant sites around the city centre, but it is complex to do it in these units that once had storage of clothing and office space in them, but are now largely sort of hidden vacancy above the shops.
Chair, if I may just follow on.
You have to be very brief.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Do you agree that we have to take into account our demographic changes? We've got growing elderly populations, we have issues with transportation, so actually, having more town centre accommodation for elderly people and people with disabilities is a good thing. We need to find a way to address that.
I do. We just need to make sure that we can't just build the houses. We also need to make sure that we have the financial mechanisms to put the doctors and the dentists and the park spaces that actually often aren't right in the city centre there, because we've also moved a lot of our hospitals in Scotland to the edge of town into sort of mega campuses. So we just need to be careful that when we create a neighbourhood, we create everything that around it. Sorry, Leigh.
To go back to how you framed the question at the start, you might like to ask, why is it so much cheaper to do the sort of things out of town? Why are we putting the signals that way, and what can we do about it? So that would be one way to think about it. The second thing is to think about the work that Scottish Futures Trust, Scottish Land Commission, Scotland's Towns Partnership have done over the last couple of years with investors and house builders, with local authorities, to see whether it's possible to do a pan-local authority operation such that we can give smaller builders, smaller developers, the opportunity to think about a pipeline across locations, so that rather than trying to scale up for one operation in town, they know there's things coming across a range of pieces, and seeing how that can be better funded and packaged up. I think there are things we can do that can build a pipeline for those sort of operations. But as James said, there are difficulties in doing that, so how do we take some of those barriers away as well?
Susan Murray.
Thank you, Chair. It's been mentioned in your answers, but just perhaps we could drill down a little bit on whether or not high streets across Scotland are facing the same challenges, or whether there are differences depending on their geography and their location, or if there are any other factors.
Every town is different. Every town is unique. People identify with that uniqueness in many ways. So you'll gather from that preamble that my answer is going to be yes, there are different things across different places. And I would expect that, and I would value that. Trying to summarize those differences by saying city good, rural bad, I think is the wrong way to think about it. There are very good high streets across different parts of Scotland. I think affluence plays a bigger role in many parts about what the town centre, and therefore the affluence of the body, will look like. But then you can have tourism coming in and changing that, and over-tourism in some locations in Scotland as well, causing issues for residents. So you're going to have all of those differences. And I think trying to find a simple good, bad, I don't think helps us. I think community is stronger in some places, but that cuts across a different sets of dimensions as well. My fundamental point underneath it, though, is that is it more expensive and more difficult to do things in many town centres than it is elsewhere? Yes. Therefore, that is a current common platform for me across all of our high streets around Scotland. But there is obviously going to be differences between the performance of some high streets and other high streets, depending on the sort of things I talked about, and also their connectivity. If you look at understanding Scottish places as a tool to look and understand some of the town centres across Scotland, you will see that there's a scale around dependence and independence and interdependence, and that's about how in cities, which is James's area of expertise, you've got urban villages and there's a connectivity around those and the flows around those. If you're on the island, it's very different as a consequence. So it's looking at the differences, building out of the assets that they've got, and reflecting on how we can make it easier in all of these places.
Yeah, I said if I had time, I'd have a look at the Scottish towns in my footfall data set, which I did over the weekend. So we've only got 12 in there, but we've sort of identified 4 sort of main types of town, with all of those types having residents in them. So that's important always to the local people. The town types we identify won't go through those, but there hasn't been the fluctuations in those 12 as much as we've seen in English towns. So that sort of says to me that, you know, they sort of are what they are, and they're sort of staying like that. So that's probably maybe a little bit simpler to sort of manage the change. My thing would be who feels they're responsible. So in Kilmarnock, who feels like we've got a problem with perceptions. We need to tell the story about what's happening with regenerate. Who is telling that story? Because one of the things we found from operating the High Street Task Force is, you know, local authorities in England didn't have the capacity, but often didn't have the capability either. They didn't have a lot of people with the sort of skill set to do this, to really get into the sort of heart of the community and business community and sort of champion place. So I think that's why we see so many differences, because things like deprivation didn't really account for the changes that we saw when we were running the task force in England. But you know, the sort of capacity for managing change within the local authority, whether there was a cross-sectoral partnership in the place representing business community, landlords and all these other sorts of people was an important point. Whether that group were focusing on the here and now as well as the future is important. So are they doing things like communicating well and activating the place with events and other things, other reasons for people to come and visit place? And then finally, you know, is all of this good work being sort of crystallised into some legitimate governance organisation that can come out of the political cycle and sort of really take on the sort of long-term interests of that location? So they were the sort of 4 things that we found from operating the task force, which explain the variability in what's going on in towns, more than sort of just looking at, like, has it got a small Marks and Spencers and those sorts of things.
So I am the MP for Mid Dunbartonshire, where we have Kirkintilloch, which is quite well known for having a town centre redevelopment scheme that was funded by the Scottish Government. But all over Mid Dunbartonshire, I am hearing exactly the feedback reflecting the comments that Professor Sparks is making about the environment for small businesses is not supporting their development and not supporting them maintaining and also not supporting them growing jobs. I also think that we have touched on the design of improving our town centres and the effect it can have on different disability groups. And I think that I'd be interested to know whether or not you think that, certainly I have the impression that when you're designing these road schemes, if disabled groups are properly consulted, there are simply small things that wouldn't cost a lot of money that would make it actually more accessible for a wide range of disability issues, and including an ageing population. But we don't appear to do that. We seem to put other factors like, you know, active transport ahead of the need to actually create communities when we're designing changes. So do you, what, you know, to frame that into a question, do you think that we are missing an opportunity when we are getting investment in town centres to be more inclusive and to encourage more people in, as well as all the other issues about trying to make sure that there's potentially more people living in the town centres?
Excuse me, before we go any further, can you make your answers very, very brief and succinct, please? We are very rapidly running out of time, I'm afraid.
Yes, we should think more carefully about the relationship between active travel and disability. I think part of the problem is that these are quite new schemes. They're often funded by different pots of money from different places, and they're testing different ways of doing bike lanes and other such things, and they're not necessarily joined up. So a much clearer regulations on exactly how bike lanes work and operate in Scottish cities for blind people, for people with other disabilities, and also for cyclists too, and for pedestrians, just generally, I think it's really important. I think we could do more on that. There's lots to learn from the schemes that haven't worked in parts of Glasgow. There's other parts of Glasgow that have bike lanes that work very well. And sometimes there's different materials used and different standards, so that should be simplified, definitely.
Do you think there's going to be a problem in the future with schemes that can't be removed because of the way that they're funded as pots of money?
I don't know, is the answer. I would like to think that if the local authority is in charge of all the schemes, because they're on public roads, they could move to a place where they're using very consistent materials and typologies, like we do for road crossings and other such infrastructure. And I think we're getting there, but we've been experimenting a bit too much.
Okay. And the town centre development, you know, we've heard you mentioning, you know, working across different groups and people working together, local councils and who's in charge. local councils are clearly under a lot of different pressures at the same time. And of course, an issue which always comes up is parking charges. Is that something that do you feel that is inhibiting town centre development, or in fact is it helping town centre development by preventing people using town centres as park and ride centres?
The poison chalice question.
No, not really. It's interesting to me. It always amazes me that the way in which we frame this subject is by saying we should remove parking charges in town centres and reduce the cash that's available to local authorities through local authority car parking, a range of others, and encourage far more car-borne transport. But we don't do that for out-of-town developments. Why not? If we were serious about wanting to level the playing field, change the playing field, we would be looking at out-of-town parking charges. We'd be looking at parking levies on workplaces that are out of town and on shopping centres that are out of town. We should be including those elements because that would give us a benefit in environmental terms and congestion terms. And these businesses rely on those things. They rely on the car parks to drive them there, but we take them out of the system. And we say, oh no, it's the fault of the town centres. It's not the fault of the town centres, it's the fault of what we've done over the last 50 years. We ought to be reversing that proposition. Are there examples where I think there is price gouging in terms of car parking? Yes, I think there are examples of that. And that does worry me, and we ought to be looking at seeing where we can try and reduce that. But if the proposition is make all car parking free across town centres, just because we can't, I don't think that's the solution to any of our problems in any way.
I have to ask members and witnesses, please, to keep their questions and answers as succinct as they possibly can in the circumstances. Angus MacDonald.
Firstly, disclosure, which should have said at the very beginning. I own several high street properties in Fort William, and I founded the Bid in Fort William. I worked very closely with Phil Prentice, who works for you, who I adore. I own the community cinema, or I founded the community cinema in the town, and the bookshop in the town, and very involved in the Pride and Place, or failure to get it. And before I start, I went round a number of towns across Britain to find out what is best. And I would say leadership in a town is the single most important thing. And if you want an example, Abergavenny, the Griffiths family, what they've done in Abergavenny is quite extraordinary in turning that town around. So the question is what changes have happened in how people use their high streets? How does that affect what sort of businesses and services remain viable? And I want to just touch on this bit about the public sector moving out of town. The police station, the medical centre, the dentists and all of that. And their office-based ones working from home, which of course is quite a problem. So could you comment on how the use of the high street is impacting the sorts of business which are viable there now?
Well, I just very quickly say all of these different changes, they're impacting all of these places, as Leigh said, in different ways, and key to this is absolutely leadership. You need local leadership and you need a local partnership to understand the change, how that's impacting on the place locally, and do something about it. Do something about it in a way that engages business community. And, you know, that's... We don't have that. We don't have Abergavenny, the family there. We don't have good business improvement districts everywhere. We don't have good local authority planning or economic development groups everywhere. So we have to work with the people that we've got, and that's what we did on the task force, is find out who is passionate about, who is acting like a place leader, and who's willing to roll up their sleeves and do something about it, and how do you support those people? So that's what the task force did. So that's my brief answer, is let's stop we know this change is going on, we know we've got to do something about it, let's start putting the people together in the structures that they need and supporting them with what they need to make those decisions in a coordinated way. So if a national policy comes through about cycling, we've got the people locally that can coordinate and make sense of that, so it doesn't undermine and damage, you know, what the long-term plan for the town and inclusivity and so on.
I would just add the need to be flexible about what city centres are, and for that leadership to recognise that they are sometimes innovative and different solutions for different types of buildings. And the other quick thing I would add is having a sort of asset managers on the ground in the actual place is really important. Sometimes these shopping centres are managed by, you know, someone in a building in London, and it's a shopping centre in Hull or in Edinburgh or something. And I think so having local asset managers who know what they're doing on the ground, have a feel of all the different connections, is also really important, because then they can be more dynamic.
To follow that up, knowing who owns what in Scottish town centres on a real-time basis would be a good thing to do, and we don't have that. It's interesting, though, you mentioned Abergavenny and Fort William, and both of the examples, in my view, have key assets within them. It's not just the families, it's also some of the assets within the places, and it's building from those assets. The change has gone on, and the change is going to go on. We see it in what people are going into town centres for, and that mix. We can alter that and begin to do things around that. But we're not going to put it back in the bottle fully, nor should we put it back in the bottle fully.
Thanks, Angus. Excuse me. If I were to ask you in one sentence what government could do to support retail in our town centres, what would your top priority answer be? I'll put that to each of you, if I may. But I'll start with Professor Sparks.
Make it cheaper and easier for retailers to operate in town centres. And that means a fiscal change.
As you described earlier?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I would just repeat the point I made about having an agency that's able to support development of housing and community uses, similar to Homes England in Scotland.
I carry on with the Scotland's Towns Partnership work, but make sure there is an active partnership in every town, and support those partnerships and evolve them if necessary. Sometimes they've become talking shops and they're not really doing anything anymore, so that needs moving the right people into that partnership so that they can take action and legitimise them. You know, if they're doing a good job, then say these are the people that should be deciding on the future of our high street.
Thank you. Christine Sullivan.
So much of the work to shape and maintain our town centres happens at a local level, but I'm interested to hear what you think national government can do to help local areas do more on having that breadth that we've spoken about this morning, for mixed-use development, promoting town centre living and reusing vacant spaces. So I think Professor Sparks, you've touched on some of the levers you'd like to see. I'd just be interested in the other views. And secondly, are there any short-term improvements that could be to high streets that could be delivered in more of the economically disadvantaged areas that you've referenced, Professor Parker, independent of wider economic regeneration efforts?
Take that one. That one first. So in the task force experience, we found that the high streets in the most deprived areas took longer time to sort of work through the programme and come up with a sort of action plan and implement things. So that says that extra sort of capacity is needed in those more deprived areas to help the partnerships. So I think that's something that national government could do, is to make that capacity available to those partnerships. A lot of people, you know, giving up their time and goodwill and so on. It's already a difficult environment. So I think some more place management capacity in either in the local authority or the business improvement district, or they might, you know, support say 2 or 3 different places. But some help.
Yeah, I was going to say similar. I think we know that planning departments and other local authority services are really stretched and their budgets are really tight, and therefore they're doing the sort of day-to-day work they need to do to process development applications and produce the statutory policy, but that means that there's probably not the same amount of money for, on-the-ground champions or officers that are supporting these types of initiatives, particularly in more deprived areas. The people that are there and able to bring those groups and partnerships together that we've been talking about, and I think that needs active funding from government.
Thank you.
I've said the main thing I would do before, so I won't reiterate that. I would agree on the capacity point. I think that's really quite important, that we support communities that are trying to do things and want to do things. They often don't have that capacity to do it. The other thing that national government could do, I've mentioned understanding Scottish places before, and usp.scot. And what we tried to build there is a data set that's consistent and comparable across all towns in Scotland. It is interesting how little data there actually is on high streets or on town centres that's publicly available on a comparable basis. There was a lot of data locked away in local governments and in national governments that could be locationally repurposed in order to better inform ourselves about our town centres and our high streets. I think we could do a lot more with the data we already collect but don't actually use in the right ways.
Donald?
I just want to talk or ask you briefly about VAT. So in Scotland, there are roughly 400,000 self-employed. As in Britain across a whole, is £90,000 the threshold. If you increase that to 250,000, then those people can employ 2 people and remain below that. And importantly, from a high street point of view, you could have a viable business. They don't want to employ anybody else, and they don't want to do the administration. Do you think increasing the threshold of VAT could make a significant difference to small traders operating in a high street?
I think you're probably going to hear from someone who knows, in terms of Colin, who knows more about that than I do in the next session, so I'll let him respond in detail. I would make a point. Anything that makes it easier for businesses, small businesses, to grow and expand is something we should be looking at very strongly. So in that sense, I agree with the sentiment you've got. Where I worry a little bit, and it applies to things like non-domestic rates as well, is we tend to be very good at building thresholds and cliff edges. Are there better ways to smooth that so there's an encouragement to actually not just go to that point and no further, but to actually think how we build businesses to expand across into bigger businesses over time? So I think I agree with the sentiment, but I'm not an expert on the detail. But I would like to see a more smoothing of the ways in which to make it easier for businesses to grow.
Anybody else?
It's not an area of expertise for me, so I'd rather not comment on that.
As politicians, we're used to speaking in areas we don't have any expertise.
Yeah. I just say, the Grimsby review, which was, I think, the one from about 6 years ago, with VAT as a sort of sales tax. There's an opportunity to sort of level the playing field between the online retailers and the on-site retailers when you look at sales tax rather than the property tax as well. So I think taxation is a big part of this. From the sort of revenue side of it, as well as the paying of it by the independent retailers.
I agree with that, but I think you were talking about VAT business registration, weren't you? Primarily?
Yes.
Just so I understood. Okay.
Susan Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Do you think that the Scottish Government's Town Centre policy framework provides a helpful foundation for Scotland's high streets to thrive? And are there any particular aspects of the policy environment in Scotland that may be different from the rest of the UK that create a more or less favourable environment on the high street? And maybe Professor Sparks.
I think the framework, and I have linked in the evidence I gave you to a diagram that tries to pull all of that together in that operation from town centre first through the place principle, through the strengthening of MPF4, all of the sort of things that have gone on in those ways, and the way in which STP does try and bring all of that together, but also make sure it's the local level that really drives all of that. I think that policy framework is very strong. I know it's been envied in some of the reports, and one's just been referenced a minute ago, and it's also been looked at very strongly in Wales and in Ireland as there's a coherence to what we've tried to do. So I think the basis of that is quite strong. Where would I like to see that going further? And you've seen hopefully some of the written stuff I've done around this. I do think we have to be stronger on what we do with existing out of town, what we do in terms of closing out of town. We've had drive-through mentioned, which I think is a massive gap in terms of MPF4. I think there's also a gulf between the policy that's written down in MPF4 and the behaviour of local councils and local members on the ground. And I think we need to get that right, and that means being much faster around the local development plans, the local place plans, getting the teams in place, as we mentioned before. So I think the policy framework is really very robust and very strong. It's the implementation of that in detail across the parts of Scotland that I worry more about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. MPF4 is an impressive statutory document, and it has some really interesting ideas that would support lots of things we're talking about. The 20-minute neighbourhood concept being one of them, where you reinvigorate space within cities and towns, and you create places under the principle that you can walk within 20 minutes to all the things you need to get to. But I do worry that there is a big gap between policy and implementation. And only a couple of years ago there was an article in The Guardian that looked at Glasgow had some of the highest numbers of drive-through restaurants approved in the whole of the UK. At the same time as there's the desire to build on brownfield land, or local authorities in the surrounding neighbourhoods, as the surrounding area around the city are building on greenfield land. And being able to change the logic of the development market and the way in which planning officers feel enabled to make quite bold decisions and refuse development where it's not sustainable. And they need the levers to be able to know that they're supported in making those sort of quite dramatic decisions on the edge, to be able to support other things happening in the centre. One thing the Scottish Government has at the current time is consulting on permitted development right extensions, which might make it a little easier to do residential in the core. That's interesting, but a sort of word of caution about that, in that it hasn't always worked very well in England, where it's allowed some very low quality housing to be produced in old office buildings. There's lots of research that's been done on this at UCL and other places. So a word of caution about the flexibility of the regulatory measures that are used. But the policy framework's there. It's all the decisions that happen downstream about what gets approved that I think we need to think more carefully about.
And if I may, one thing I would have said on that a good example of that, I think, is things like compulsory purchase orders. The framework's there. When was the last one done? Well, I know that, again, there's consultation on that, or compulsory sales orders, and we've gone to auctions in England, which is where there's a difference there, and the threat of that seems to actually work in some places. So it's about giving that confidence that actually the levers can be pulled and should be pulled.
So can I just then continue on that sort of theme, Professor Spark, and ask that, since you led the review of Scotland's Town Centre Action Plan in 2021, how much progress do you think has been made on the recommendations?
Okay, if I divide the answer into two, if I may. There were 3 areas of recommendations in terms of the main areas of recommendations. One was planning, one was tax, one was sector and investment in places. I think on planning with MPF4, it went a long way. I think it could do further. I think I've made my data point before. On the third one, in terms of investment in certain areas, particularly in town centre living, I think it's been slower than we would have liked, but I think there's been a fair amount that's gone on there. Circumstances between 2021 and 2025 changed for obvious reasons, with cost of living, cost of doing business, so it's made it more difficult. But I think we are trying to do the right things in those areas. There has been very little that's probably an overestimate of progress on the fiscal levers and taxation elements.
Thank you. Thank you.
And next question's from Kirsten Sullivan.
I was just going to follow up on the point that you made around some of the planning aspects and also compulsory purchase orders. Do you believe that some of these, the deliverability of the policy framework and other initiatives is largely hampered due to the lack of resourcing and funding at local government level, where a lot of these things have to be implemented?
That was the experience we found in the task force in England. I mean, there's statutory responsibilities in the local authority that only the local authority can do, but a lot of the sort of the groundwork, the consultation, the understanding, the sort of like the strategy can be done by sort of cross-sector partnerships. So I think we need more capacity in local authorities, but not all the decisions can be taken there. So that capacity has to go to some of those statutory responsibilities, so they can, you know, use compulsory purchase orders and so on, but also supporting the sort of decision making in the larger group as well. And both of those were missing in England.
I think it's capacity and confidence.
Capability, yeah. Okay.
It's your question, Leigh. Sorry.
One thing can I add something on that? Or
Yeah, of course, sorry.
Just to add that it's been interesting to see greater devolution and introduction of mayoral systems and combined authorities in England. Obviously that similar thing hasn't happened in Scotland. And I'm not an expert on whether mayors work perfectly in certain places, but I do wonder whether Scotland perhaps misses a trick in its big cities in particular, not having a mayoral figure that able to get on the TV or on the Today programme and make their case in the same way that some of the high-profile mayors can in England. But also, by not having combined authorities, perhaps it's a little bit more difficult for some of the more strategic thinking that needs to happen, say, across the Glasgow or Edinburgh region or Aberdeen region, to be done in a coordinated fashion. That the policy making becomes more difficult when different local authorities have different objectives.
Okay, if I can ask very quickly, where we have seen success in our high streets, what do you think have been the most important factors in that success? And what role do you think that physical and cultural heritage play in high street improvement and regeneration?
I think you'll know what I'm going to say. it's the people and it's the partnerships. In terms of culture and heritage, those town types that we look for in the usage patterns of towns over the period of the High Street Task Force, we saw more towns become speciality towns, and that, you could link that back to the cultural and heritage-led regeneration. So they're bringing assets back into use, and then they're attracting a different profile of people to use the town in different ways. So it shows it's a very legitimate regeneration strategy. But you don't need to do big physical schemes to uncover hidden culture and heritage in towns. And this is where civic societies and local groups like that, with a little bit of support and funding and linked into the sort of like more longer term regeneration plans, can really start to sort of like change the narrative and perceptions on towns. So thinking about all of that in the mix.
I think one thing that's happened in the big cities, the research we did sort of in 21-22, where we were looking at sort of changing shopping centres and other big facilities, was that the shock of so much closure and bankruptcy did lead to different types of investors coming into city centres, so that are less passive. So they weren't just holding a shopping centre, thinking of it as part of the pension fund investment and thinking that Debenhams will be in there for 50 to 100 years. They started being more nimble and thinking, okay, how can we change this structure, this building? Do we use different types of leases? Do we allow different operators to come in? Where BHS left, could we put a cinema in there and some restaurants around it? And I think that sort of different type of actor coming in, different type of investor, has actually helped some cities to be more dynamic than we might have expected them to be at the sort of at the very worst of the period of bankruptcy. It's also meant that some of those investors, the ones that used to buy and operate shopping centres, have also diversified themselves. They've moved out of shops and retail, and some of them have started moving into residential, and looking at whether residential through build to let can work in particular places. So those kind of changes are interesting to research a bit further, I think.
Physical and cultural heritage. I quite like my garden. I've got a couple of buddleias in my garden. I prefer to keep them in my garden rather than in the streets that we see. My point is, if you look at the streetscape of many of our town centres, the buildings are neglected, partly because we don't know who owns them. They've got landlords that are nowhere near. We need to think about what that says to people and visitors. The buildings have been allowed to decay. The physical importance, the streetscape, is really important and significant. It's part of our town urban heritage, and we're not looking after it because the people who own the places aren't looking after it. In terms of cultural heritage, absolutely critical, I think. I chair Made in Stirling, CIC, which is the trading arm of Creative Stirling, which is an organisation that tries to improve and enhance and link all of the creativity and activity within the Stirling area. We have a retail shop on the high street. It is one of the most interconnected organisations through the place and through the town. It's really important in a variety of different ways. Radical Weavers in Stirling, exactly the same sort of thing. These places are really important. They're small scale in many ways, but punch well beyond their weight. So physical heritage has to be looked after, cultural heritage, and all towns will have some assets of that form they can build on, is really vital as well.
Thank you, and if I could just ask Professor White very quickly, what does your work on urban retrofitting suggest about how best to build sustainability goals into regeneration?
So our project on urban retrofit is all about the implementation gap that I think I mentioned a moment ago, where we have these really strong aspirations in national policy, but we struggle sometimes to implement them at the local level. So that project, which is ongoing, we just did our first research interviews earlier this week with chief planners in certain cities. So there are lots to go on. But what we're finding initially is that there are lots of initiatives to retrofit cities, from bike lanes to densification schemes to community gardening schemes where Leigh would have grow his plants, to all these different sorts of things that can happen at lots of different scales, right? But they're often not very connected up. And often the decision making lags in terms of the sort of boldness of decision about what happens when. And so what we're trying to do in that project is try and see what the linkages are between them. But it's ongoing. I don't want to, we haven't got the results yet. So, but that's our aim, is to try and understand the relationship between policy aspiration for climate and planning, and actually what happens on the ground in the implementation, which we think currently just aren't talking to each other as well as they could.
Thank you.
Douglas McAllister.
The UK government's Pride in Place programme will see £480 million of investment across 24 areas in Scotland over this decade. For instance, in my constituency of West Dunbartonshire, on top of the £20 million for Dumbarton Town Centre regeneration, we now have £20 million Pride in Place funding for Clybank Town Centre, and £1.5 million immediate impact funding to be spent this year across our 3 areas. That's happening up and down Scotland. Will these initiatives help revitalise Scottish high streets and town centres? My thoughts on that from the task force was that these funds can be incredibly helpful. I mean, it's actual funding, and with Pride in Place as well, there's a new governance body that's set up, which has to be chaired by someone independent and has to have business representation and so on. So, that's a good start for the right decisions to be made.
we found through the task force is that where the boards were more than just looking after the project, so they took an active view on what was happening in the high street now, rather than just managing the funding, then that's sort of key to success. You know, otherwise it could be just another set of projects that's layered over other projects that are happening already. So it's that sort of connection between the Pride in Place, and if they become the sort of partnership for, you know, representing business improvement districts and other things that are already there, then I think that can be very, very powerful.
A few points, if I may. I'm always going to say that any investment into a place, I'm never going to say it shouldn't happen. So we should be investing in places in the way that we do. I think what's happened has had a bit of a stop-start, and hopefully it'll now gain a bit of momentum around certainly the first elements of the Pride in Place processes that were going on. I worry, and it goes back to a comment earlier, that in some of the neighbourhoods that have been looked at, whether there is sufficient capacity and how we build the capacity in those places, I think could be really very important. I also think there's a little bit of a worry I have, which from my experience on City Deal would make me caution. You started off your question with very large numbers, and that's what people will hear. But it's very large numbers over 10 years. In 2 years' time, people will say, you've spent all of that money. What's the impact? And I think that's setting up a potential dissonance. It worries me because you won't be spending all that money in that short period of time. The flex isn't sufficient within that to do it. I would caution about going with the big numbers to start with, but talk more about building the neighbourhoods up over a period of time, sustained investment, those sorts of things, which is what you're doing. But I worry that the message, the presentation, to go back to an earlier point, is going to be heard in a different way. And I think that could mean that some of them won't have the effect you want them to have.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your evidence this morning. It's been extremely helpful. You probably gathered we could probably have sat and talked with you for the rest of the day, never mind the morning. But thank you very much. I think it'll be really helpful to us as we begin our inquiry. So once again, thank you. And order. We're going to private session. Resume the second session with our second panel of this meeting today, and we'd like to welcome Mr. Borland. Would you like to briefly tell us who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Colin Borland. I'm the Scotland Director for the Federation of Small Businesses, which is a direct member business organisation that provides small business owners and self-employed with a range of business services and also acts as an advocate in government.
Thank you very much. We've heard a lot about how online has affected traders in our high streets. Is that the same issue for smaller traders that you would be working with as it is for the bigger high street retailers that we traditionally knew?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a fact of life. And I think whereas obviously the challenges that presents are well documented, there's also opportunities around about that as well. I mean, a number of small businesses who have got bricks and mortar premises say that it's the online offering that allows them to sell to the world that sustains the bricks and mortar offering. If you look at the latest report we did in high streets, now these are UK figures, but from the 2025, something like the main route to customers for those who are in retail is 80% say face-to-face. But a very close second at 63% is online. So it's something that small businesses are using, embracing, but there's no point in pretending that we don't have to deal with the consequences that flow from that, let's be honest, irreversible change in consumer behaviour.
And in terms of those that are physically present in the high streets, are there any sectors that have fared better than others?
I mean, like Rala, the previous panel was saying, I think the high street is a creature of pragmatism. It doesn't have any divine right to exist in its current form. So it was born out of pragmatism, and its future lies in pragmatism. And I think, as the previous panel was saying, it's about giving people what they want. It's about reflecting the lives of busy consumers and giving them what they want at a price in a way that they want to consume it. So absolutely retail is going to have an important part in that, but you also need to think about hospitality, leisure, experiences and things that you simply can't get online. That sort of individual one-to-one personal service, that advice on particular specialist products, that sort of friendly personal service. That's where I think people have to focus, but there's no question that the future of our town centres and high streets, and I do, I take Professor Spark's point, but I'm not an academic, so I do use the terms interchangeably, because I think the corporate challenges facing them are relatively the same, but I think the future lies in that sort of mixed use and giving people what they want the way they want it.
And do you think your members' perception of the high street has changed over the years?
Yes. The most recent question we asked about this was at the beginning of, it was last year, and about 45% of our members do business in or around the high street stroke town centre. And of them, 55% said that they felt that it was an area of decline, that things were going in the wrong direction. And again, when you dig into that a little bit, and you look at the littorals and you look at some of the feedback we've done from roundtables on it, it's a lot of the same things. It's practical challenges about demographics, it's about the cost, but it's also begins to bring in all sorts of other policy areas, like it's about how safe people feel the streets are, it's about how accessible in terms of public transport, etc., etc. It's also to do with the general state of the economy and how your customers are feeling and how much money they think they've got in their pocket. So there's a lot of factors begin to sort of combine, and I suppose what's happened to high streets and town centres is a very visible manifestation of that, but it is happening across the economy.
Yes, thank you. Susan Murray.
So what contribution can small businesses make to sustaining and revitalising high streets?
And I think the relationship's absolutely symbiotic, and I think small businesses, we've got a good record of employing people locally, employing people who tend to be further from the labour market. We know that money that's spent local stays local and generates around the economy. I think everyone's job here is to contribute to that critical economic mass that keeps a particular town or high street viable. Beyond delivering services to people and attracting people in, obviously we're providing jobs, generating revenues and everything else that flows from that.
So how can small businesses work with local authorities and communities to achieve this? You have argued in written evidence that local authorities need to do more to get local businesses buy-in for regeneration initiatives. you know, how do you think that can happen in practice?
I think where these things work best, it's where you've got that buy-in, you've got that dialogue, and you're talking to people. I mean, I think there is a feeling in certain quarters that things that have been done on your behalf have been done to you rather than with you. And Chair, you mentioned there, I mean, obviously the Sauchiehall Street example is a very good example. And again, declaring an interest is we are an employer very near Sauchiehall Street, not a massive employer, but we do have an office and people based there. And there's no sort of communication there. There is apparently a grand plan that this is going to be the cultural quarter. I don't know who decided that. I'm not quite sure it's the council's decision. But apparently that's what it's going to be. That's what we're going to get. And the way it was done, and again, those of you who are familiar with the street, it took a long time. It kind of looks exactly the same as it did when they started. So I'm not quite sure I'm sure it's jolly good what they've done underneath. But, and I think that, again, it's that sort of thing about talking to people, giving them that, sort of tell them this is what we're going to do, and it's for your own good and go on with it, rather than actually listening to local business community and talking about what works. And I think it's like Mr McAllister made the point then about UK SBF and what's going to come and replace it. And again, if you look at those sorts of projects, ones that the hallmarks of the ones that have been successful are the ones where people went out and said to the local business community, can you tell us what you need? Rather than saying, for example, right, we want oven-ready projects that are ready to go now, so guess who can apply for them? People who are already in the space doing the same sort of thing, who've got something that are ready to go with it. So I think casting your net wide and getting that genuine buy-in from the business community, not just people with whom you've got established links, I think would probably pay dividends in the long run.
So how do your members feel about bids locally?
It's a mixed picture. I think so in some cases we've got members who are really enthusiastic about them, indeed we've got some who are very closely involved with them. There are other areas where they've maybe not brought the local business community with them, and they have a feeling that, well, we're just paying twice for the same stuff. So I think, and again, I think bids, if you talk to people who run them, they'll accept that they're not going to be the right solution everywhere. So I think it'll vary from bid to bid. And I think if you look at those that are successful, again, the characteristics are that they're delivering on the priorities that local business community has identified.
Thank you.
Ms MacDonald.
What can local government do to encourage small businesses to open in the high street?
I think we need to make it can't be a place that we're trying to force people back to. It needs to be a place of choice that people are actually determined to get to. I think the public sector has a role, I think, as an economic actor. And again, we've spoken a bit about the need for that mix of sectors. So, try to have as many, non-retail, non-hospitality jobs, public sector jobs. They're good, they're well paid, they're secure. Have them located in town centres. I think about how you're spending the money that you're spending anyway, in terms of buying locally. And again, some of the changes that we hope to get through the Community Wealth Building Bill that's going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment might help to bring that about. I also think issues around about regulating sensibly. So if we've got things about not just alcohol licences, but public entertainment licences, hot food licences, etc., get them done as easily and quickly as you possibly can. Change of use is another one as well. And also thinking about some areas where the council might be a landlord. So again, what are they doing to incentivise getting those any empty units that they have, getting them filled? Or possibly, if they're the wrong size, the wrong shape, what can they do maybe to repurpose them?
Lillian Jones.
Hello. You've been critical of high street banks closing down town centre branches. What practical impact does this have on small businesses?
I think for small businesses, I think there's two things. There's the practical impact of if you're a cash-based business, how do you deposit that cash? And you either take time out your business to drive to the nearest place where you can make that deposit. You may have some sort of mobile banking service, but then everyone knows when that van's coming round. And if you send someone out with a big bag of, cash, I would worry about employees' safety. And I think there's also this other thing as well. We don't just use banks for those day-to-day transactions. I mean, I remember when there used to be sort of trusted advisors with the bank manager. Your local bank manager had a sort of status in your community, and going to get that sort of advice about, oh, I'm thinking about taking on a second shop, and them saying, all right, where? Oh no, don't do that. Why not? Because I happen to know the council's got plans to bring in a one-way system there, therefore your footfall's going to plummet, therefore do it over here. It's that sort of advice, that sort of chatting things through that I really feel that we've lost. And again, the secondary impact is, again, it as what were previously secure but still very well paid jobs in sectors that are not retail, leisure, hospitality. You've lost them and their spending power from the local economy, and that again obviously is going to have a knock-on effect on footfall and turnover.
Are there other examples of services or amenities that you see as crucial to maintain town centres, either to directly facilitate small business operations or to drive customer footfall?
I mean, I think you have to have that whole suite of services there. So yes, your banking, bits of the public sector. I mean, people talk about attractions, so things like having your leisure centre there, your library, the health centre, as many of these things as possible, along with sensible policies around about practical things like parking, a functioning public transport system. All of these things, I think, combined create that, or help create the conditions whereby that sort of critical economic mass can be maintained.
And just, you mentioned parking. Do your members feel that paying for parking within the town centres is an inhibitor to footfall?
Yes, and you just, I think that recently was at Haddington, in East Lothian. There was a very controversial proposal put forward there, and you saw the reaction from the local business community, and particularly in areas which are in towns that are just outside the big cities, where you've got the option, the easy option of going to a large out-of-town shopping centre where there'll be hundreds of free parking spaces. People point to the the unlevel playing field there and say, well, how is this possibly going to help? How is this reflecting modern consumer behaviour?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, MacDonald.
Coming back to the VAT question, which I heard you watching carefully when they spoke. So the Federation of Small Business is, like me, in favour of increasing the limit. £90,000 is not enough revenue for a shop to justify a shop. And so lots of small businesses appear to be avoiding the high street because they need to stay under 90,000 to be viable. If it was increased to £250,000, then all of a sudden a lot of small businesses could move into the high street who are currently avoiding it. Do you think that's a viable proposition for government?
I think the case for raising the VAT threshold is unarguable. I mean, I think at the moment there is a considerable body of evidence of bunching just below. And if you get a bid in to say, can you do some work? You should be thinking, right, how am I going to win this contract? You shouldn't be thinking, what's my 12-month, vatable qualifying turnover looking like? Can I do it? Is this going to be? That's an dictionary definition of a brake on economic growth. I mean, at the moment, we've said that a rise to 100,000 would be a sensible first step on that journey. And that's the one that I think the Treasury's modelled, and I believe that the Treasury's documents themselves say that that becomes revenue positive by years 4 and 5. So again, I think you can see, because of the economic activity it's going to generate in the longer term, it makes sense. Whether or not, I don't think we've looked at modelling to 250k, but again, if that is the direction of travel, then we're absolutely in favour.
Mr Borland, other than tax changes, what else could the UK and Scottish governments do to support small businesses?
Oh, that's a nice easy one. But I think, the tax is helpful. I think, we've spoken a little bit, we touched on it, about thinking about how they get a better economic impact from money that they're spending anyway. So not spending more, but thinking about spending locally. And again, there's some legislative changes going through at Holyrood at the moment, which, if the Stage 2 amendments go the way that we want them to go, then I think that has the potential to make a real difference. Because you think about your big, I don't just mean councils. People sometimes pick in councils and say, well, you should be doing this, that. There's a lot of bits of the public sector that operate in our communities, and some of them have the role of almost as anchor institutions. What they should be doing is having coordinated sort of place-based procurement strategies that try to buy as much as is practical and sensible locally, and that should be underpinned by statutory targets. It should also be reported on. There should be statutory rules there about how that's actually reported on, because at the moment there's no rhyme or reason to it, so it's really difficult to compare like with like. But what we do know is that in areas where local authorities have set themselves targets, I think Click Managers is cited as an example, because they're working to that target, they go in and beat it. So it proves that it can be done, and the economic benefit from that is tangible. I also think that government as a whole needs to recognise the role that it plays as an economic actor in communities, because it does, again, get back to this point about spreading a risk across sectors. It acts as, it's a significant employer. It employs a lot of people on very good money and very safe and very safe jobs. So, if we're not going to get, if there isn't the demand for certain types of businesses and services or premises operating in town centres, well, let's repurpose those buildings and get more people back in the town centres and working from town centres where you're taking that spending power with them during the day. So I think, there's something I could go on and on, but that would be my top couple.
So you mentioned premises there, which is actually interesting, and I wondered then if small businesses can play a role on taking on currently vacant properties. Would that be something your members would be interested in doing?
Yeah, and there is, what's it called, like Fresh Start, for example, when you're taking over a property, I think, and again, I think it's something like 69% of our members have reported vacancies on their high streets. Mm-hmm. So again, there is, it's a very visible sign. There are things at Fresh Start, but obviously the current continued levels of vacancies would suggest that on its own is not enough. But I think, yes, the more we can do to encourage people to take on those units and repurpose them. Again, if units have been left by, say, maybe sort of middle-sized retailers, there's not a huge amount of call for that in its current form. So what could we do with that? How could we repurpose that? How could we get people together to make that happen? Again, I think is an interesting point. But we also need to look at things like, if we want to be really bold, have a look at the Scottish commercial property market, because it's almost entirely unregulated. I think there's one sort of piece of post-World War II legislation that's mainly about bombed-out shops. So I think we have moved on a little bit from them, and I think there's quite a power imbalance between landlord and tenant. And in an ideal world, we would treat small tenants much more like domestic tenants in terms of the balance of rights and responsibilities. So I think if we could do that, make it less risky, make it more affordable, then yeah, absolutely, people would want to come in if it's a business model that is going to work. We don't need yet more, another sort of faddy sort of, a retailer to spring up and it's dead in, 12 weeks once they've run out of money. They have to be sensible, valid, otherwise viable business propositions.
Can I just ask you? It's not something that's come up so far, I don't think, but has this sort of trend that we saw developing after COVID of people working from home more affected the businesses that you work with? Yeah,
I think it's particularly pronounced maybe city centres, and you talk to people in city centres to say things like pubs in the city centre will say that Thursday night's their new Friday night, and things like that in certain areas. It's not the same for everyone, and I think demographics are different as well. I think, bits of Glasgow city centre, for example, there's a lot of financial services jobs. Younger people, I think they tend to be there or thereabouts, whereas I think the public sector has been quite slow to sort of get people back to the office, and I think that obviously does, because you think about, now that things like peak rail fares are abolished and everything else, you wonder what could happen if we had a sort of concerted, campaign to say, come back into town. It's great because, at lunchtime you can nip out for that little bit of shopping, you can catch up with somebody for a coffee, you can get a swift half, on your way around a corner of the train station, on your way home. Just, it's much more sociable than sitting eating a bit of toast in front of your laptop,
Mm-hmm.
But
okay. Kirstine Sullivan.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about vacant properties there, if using some of them as almost pop-ups to bridge the gap between, or bridge a transition between online and having a bricks and mortar presence in the high street might kind of de-risk that shift and allow online businesses just to try it out.
But yeah, the more you can do, I mean, even before all this began, even before COVID, we knew there's certain barriers in a business's development, the bits where they get to and stop. One is the VAT threshold, another one is moving from the self-employed to taking on your first employee, and a third one is moving from your garage or your van or your kitchen table to your first premises. And I think anything that you can do to ease any of those 3 steps has got to be sensible. And as you say, if the asset is sitting there, if there's a risk or less risky way of doing it and trying to prove that concept, then yeah, why wouldn't you go and explore that?
Murray.
I'm interested in those 3 steps. The move in particular from the garage or the van to taking a premises. What's your experience of, or from your members, what are you hearing about people who are actually, we talk about the high street will thrive on person-to-person contact, and so we have the nail bars, the salons, and these sort of things. But how do your members feel about people who are actually now moving from employment in the high street to set up at home in home premises that they've perhaps built in their back garden, and that seems to be a spin-off of COVID because more people think about it and more people have it.
If that's what works for them, then fine. I think what we have to do is make sure that that doesn't become an exodus that leaves our town centres and high streets looking like a ghost town, So there has to be that pipeline, and how you do that is exactly what we've been talking about this morning, but how do you make it an attractive place? So we're not trying to force people into it at gunpoint, we're actually saying, no, that I'm choosing, I'm making an active choice because this is the right thing for my business.
Mr. Borland, thank you very much. That has been very interesting. We managed to get through quite a lot of questions there in a relatively short time, so we're very grateful to you for your very succinct answers.
Not at all, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order.